Welcome to RCR Wireless News. I'm Martha DeGrasse, and I'm joined today by Chris Stark. He is Head of Business Development for Nokia Networks North America. Chris, thank you very much for being here today.
Well, thank you for hosting this.
Our topic today is investing in hetnets, and I'd like to start off by talking about hetnets in metropolitan areas. Can you share with us some of the key drivers for small cell investment in city areas?
Yeah, what we're seeing in city areas is we're seeing the demand for traffic growing. We're seeing people utilizing their mobile devices for applications. They're becoming very video heavy, and so a big draw in terms of capacity. What I think we're going to see is, as we continue to see this sort of shift and the growth of data on these networks, there's going to become an increasing demand to densify networks inside large metropolitan areas. And I think the demand's going to come from things that we don't necessarily think about as first order effects. If you think about, just give you an example. If you think about the whole movement towards autonomous vehicles and the idea that cars can drive themselves, when you're sitting in a car that's driving itself, you've got time on your hands. When you're sitting in a car that's in an autonomous generated traffic jam, you've got even more time on your hands. And I think when you're sitting there, there's this sort of insatiable demand on all of us to be connected, to talk to people, to get on your mobile device, do the video call, do your social updates, and so on. So I think what's happening is that you're going to see other technologies that perhaps start to unencumber us in terms of the things that we do. And just my observation from looking at my kids and everything, people can't resist the opportunity as soon as they've got a minute to get on their device and start tweeting, chatting, whatever, posting video clips. So I think just generally what we see is a lot of things are happening that are going to generate more traffic, and obviously where you see a concentration of people, that's where we're going to see a lot more in terms of a need for densification of the network. I think globally, I think we're going to be somewhere around 7 billion people connected 2015. I mean, certainly our view is that in the next five years or so, we're going to see that the networks will need to support 1,000 times more capacity than they do today. So if you just think about that, if you take a city and say, look at cities that are over 50,000 people in the United States at the moment, I think there's over 700 cities over 50,000 people in the United States. So just look at what that's going to do in terms of the demand, in terms of what it's going to put as pressure on the network. And then subsequently, I think it will put pressure on this whole need to build out small cell networks and densify the network itself.
So that leads to one of the phrases that you have used, which is ultra-dense networks in these cities with more than 50,000 people. So what are some of the components here? You need small cells, you need fiber, and you need to really pay attention to the locations that are available for these deployments, right?
No, absolutely. And I think it speaks to one of the things we did about 12 months ago. We sat down and asked ourselves the question. People, if you go back two years or so ago, people were talking about huge numbers of small cells deployed in cities. And, you look at demand, and demand continues to grow, and you ask yourself, well, why is it that those networks aren't there, or we don't have visibility of those large networks being there today? And I think our take on it is that essentially, there's a return on investment calculation that has to be made and is being made all the time. And really the return on investment at this point is a simple return on investment against the macro cell. And I think the things that we saw in the small cell network, and I think you can lump outside DAS into this, you can lump some of the other things that people are trying, C-RAN and so on, is there's a lot of cost that's not associated with the AP, the technology itself. There's a lot of cost all in how do you facilitate the network. As you mentioned, there's backhaul costs in there, getting attached to a fiber, getting power to the location, finding a location and developing the location. So I think what we've seen at the moment is that equation that you see where basically you look at the return on investment, you look at the costs associated with deploying these small cell ultra dense networks, and then the costs associated with just deploying a macro. And I think the balance is tilted towards adding more capacity at the macro level for the moment. I think the things that are changing, and this is an equation that we believe continues to change, I think the value of the spectrum is going to be one of the things that changes that equation. What we've seen in the spectrum auctions over the last 6 to 9 months is that the value of spectrum has gone up significantly. So then you look at it and say, well, really the pressure on the carriers to make better use of that spectrum and to densify the network starts to impinge on them. I think the other thing that we looked at is that, you know, you really ought to create a view that allows people to understand this return on investment. And we're looking at the idea of creating a site value index that helps you understand when you look at a particular set of street assets or whatever, how does that match up with the idea of just going and developing a macro, and how does that play into could you and is it worth going ahead and building an ultra dense network there?
So the site value index helps you identify the best spot for a deployment. But once you've identified the location, what are some of the next factors to consider?
So the site value index itself is a very simple equation, because what it will do is it takes a numerator of the equation, which is all the positive impacts that you can take from putting a location, from developing a location. And those would be things like what you do in terms of coverage, capacity, and hitting more users. I think the denominator is all the piece about the impacts, the cost impacts associated with creating that impact. So, you know, you look at it and it will be the cost of digging a street. It will be the cost of whether you end up having to get across what we're terming negative assets inside the city. And by negative assets, what we're looking at is things like gas lines, like the tram lines and so on, that inevitably create more cost. And so from our perspective, I think one of the keys here is to try and understand the environment better. And I think what we're trying to look at is say, let's use this site value index as a vehicle for us to understand all of those assets better and understand exactly how does that return on investment calculation work for the people wanting to build out.
And carriers, I'm guessing, are extremely interested in understanding their projected return on investment as they start to consider this.
Yeah, and I think what drives it is that at the moment what we see is when you look at that site value index, there's an enormous variability on the number that you can come out with. And the variability is impacted not necessarily by technology things, but it's impacted by you turn up to a location you want to develop, you find out that the location has a number of street poles or whatever there that you'd like to go and try and develop, but maybe they've already got cameras on them that say you can't get there, or maybe there's an obstruction that you didn't understand was there. So suddenly you can take what you'd hoped at the start was a very defined cost to develop a location, and now you've got to modify that. You've got to move the location, you've got to understand those costs where the new location is. And I think this variability is so big at the moment that I think that's an impediment to mass deployment. I think those are the things that you've got to get under control and fully understand. And I think once you provide that certainty, that return on investment calculation becomes a lot easier to prove that ultra-dense networks really are, you can go ahead and you can build and you know exactly what it's going to cost you, how much it's going to cost even once you've built it to maintain it and operate it. And I think those are the things that that really will help trigger this concept of mass deployment.
So really the integrators and installers on the ground that can deliver some of this very specific information about the proposed sites have an important role to play, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, because I think what you're seeing is that there's been this sort of very defined ecosystem generated in the macro world, and it's become somewhat consolidated, where you see a lot of people who hold a lot of towers and locations, and the towers are fed by fiber and so on. And now what you're looking at is a different ecosystem. It's not one that's necessarily that well controlled at the moment. I think the city governments have a part to play because of the planning restrictions and the laws. And I think if you look at their part in this, they could actually make things easier for people to go in and build. They could facilitate some of this build by just looking at how they deal with some of the issues around densification. I think the people who own fiber and build the fiber, they have a part to play. The people who have the power available in the cities, they have a part to play. And then you look at the other side, which I mentioned, which is we're calling negative assets. I think they're negative assets in this equation, but I mean obviously they're positive assets for the city. But I mean, they're things like the gas lines, knowing where they are, because clearly you start a construction, you hit a gas, you come up against an obstacle that you don't understand, and then your costs start to balloon. So I think there's a whole bunch of people now that need to play a part in understanding these. You know, how do we take that variability and start to minimize it? And so, yeah, I think it's going to be a fascinating sort of walk forward from here. And it does need a lot of people to try and play a part. And I think the other thing is you know, I think it's partly incumbent upon us to try and understand and bring the benefits to the metropolitan areas and make sure that they understand what is it going to do for them. And you know, again, so I think there's a number of people involved in this, and each of us has sort of a duty to try and come along and play, I'll say, play nicely in amongst all this.
Right, yeah, I think a lot of times we see the metropolitan areas very open to the investment around a certain event or a sporting season or something like that, and then, you know, obviously that network investment is in place long after the event is over.
Yeah, yeah, so what you can see is that obviously the motivation and so on has been, and there was a need and a demand, and it was set. And I think then when you look and say, okay, but now you're going to have a demand and a need in a lot of other places inside the city. And again, I think it comes back to, number one, is an education of how that need and demand is going to grow and what it's going to do to benefit the municipalities as they allow these things to sort of balloon. And so I think, again, part of it is an incumbent upon us to try and make sure that that value is really well understood.
All right, Chris Stark, Head of Business Development for Nokia North America. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us today?
Yeah, the one, just when we go back to what we sat down and looked at, say, 12 months ago, I think the other piece that really came across to us is scale. It was scale issues. And so by that, we looked at a particular street in a city and sat around and tried to understand how we could do this idea of site value index in that street. But then when you sat back, you looked at it and said, well, okay, so there's over 700 cities in the United States with in excess of 50,000 people. So it's no good just doing it in one street in one city. You've got to come out with an idea about how does that actually grow to as many cities as you can. And if what you do is you start off in every city with a blank piece of paper and you say, okay, let's have another go at this, and you can't create something that's scalable, I think that's going to be a terrible impediment to the growth. And again, a number of the things that we talked about, I think, play into this. So I think really the issue about how do you, once you've got a methodology, once you've got the concept of this site value index, what you really want then is you want to know that you can scale it. And I think if you just look from an operator perspective, if they're going to make investments, it comes back to the fact, you know, they're trying to give coverage and capacity on a fairly broad basis across the country. And so, you know, you've got to go in and understand that that's what they need to do. So don't try and just hit one particular intersection and think how brilliant you are at that. It's got to be something a lot bigger than that.
All right, Chris Stark, Nokia Networks, thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, thank you.